Okay, we're back. We're going to continue talking about topics that relate to rendering, but in this case, we're not going to talk directly about rendering. What we're going to talk about is materials and shaders in 3ds Max. So, how do we apply different materials and shaders to these teapots to change their color, change the way that they look? Well, it's pretty simple. What we need to use is 3ds Max's material editor. Now, the material editor is where you can go to set up all your shaders and materials to change the way that things look. So if you wanted something to look like a rock, that's where you would go to change the material. If you wanted something to look like nice porcelain or ceramic tiles, that's where you would go to change the material. So how do we open up the material editor? Well, there's a long way and there's a short way, as usual. The long way is to come up here to this icon that says Material Editor, which really isn't that long if you think about it. But you can use the shortcut key on the keyboard, which is even faster, which is the M key. Just remember M for Material Editor. So hit M, and that'll open up the Material Editor. So here's our Material Editor window. Just expand that out a little bit. And this is the way it works. You get these sample slots up here where you can set up different shaders and materials. And then down here, when you have one of those shaders selected, you'll get all the options that belong to that shader. So you can edit it, change it, fine tune it to however you want. Okay? So how do we apply these shaders? Well, let's go ahead and apply a shader to, say, this green teapot that's down here. This one right there. Okay? Right now it's green, but we want to apply a material to it. So let's apply this first material, which is called 01-default by default. To apply this material, we can do it a number of ways. A very simple, quick, and intuitive way of doing this is simply by left-clicking on this material in the material editor and just dragging it and dropping it right on top of the teapot. It's really that simple. Once you do that, you'll notice the teapot turns gray. The teapot now has that material. And if I hit Shift and Q to do a quick render here, you notice the teapot changed from green to gray. So let me close that. Now I can go ahead and start to edit this material and watch the changes update in the viewport. Just keep in mind that the viewport will never show you a truly faithful representation of what the material will look like when you do a final render. Okay? So what can we do with these materials? Well, this is a material right here. Here we have shader basic parameters. Right now what we have is a standard material. What does that mean? Well, there's different types of materials in 3ds Max. The default material is the standard material. How do I know that? Well, right here in this button you can see it says standard. If I click on that button, it opens up a material map browser and I can go ahead and choose different materials. So here's standard down there. There's standard materials and there's all kinds of different materials. For example, I can choose ink and paint. Ink and paint is a material that mimics cell shading. So if you've ever seen cell shading in some video games or even in some movies and in some cartoons on broadcast television, a lot of stuff is done in 3D, and then ink and paint shaders are used to trick the viewer into thinking that it's 2D. You can also use DirectX shaders for doing real-time graphics. We can use architectural shaders if you're into doing architectural visualizations, and so on and so forth. I'm going to hit cancel because I'm going to leave it at the standard material. Then down here on the shader basic parameters, we can change the type of shader that this material has. So the default here is blend. Now we have different types of materials: anisotropic, blend, metal, multi-layer, ordinary blend, and a whole bunch of different materials. Okay, so a quick run through. Anisotropic is good for doing brushed metals and things like that. It's pretty good for doing brushed copper or even brushed aluminum. Blend shader is a pretty general shader that can be used for a multitude of things. You can use it to do concrete, you can use it to do wood, you can use it for plastic, even for metal, even in some cases for glass or something very shiny. The metal material is good for doing metal, but you can adjust it and use it for other things as well. Okay? The multi-layer lets you layer multiple materials on top of each other. The ordinary blend is similar to the blend, a little bit different in the way that it shows its specular highlights and so forth. The Fong is good for doing plastics, but again, if you edit it enough, you can use it for pretty much anything. Same goes for the Strass, although the Strass is a very good shader for doing metallic type objects. And the translucent shader lets you create just that, objects that look translucent. Okay, so let's go ahead and see how we can go ahead and change the look of this teapot right here. I'll zoom into it a little bit. And I'll hit Shift Q to open up the little render window here. And we're going to be using this to do some renders. Now I'm going to use the region tool to go ahead and just render this teapot because I don't need to render out the rest of this scene. I already know what it looks like. I just want to render out this teapot to see what it looks like. So I'll go to View and I'll switch over to Region. And I'll place the region tool right over the teapot and change the size with the selection handles. And now when I hit render, it's just going to render that area right there. Okay, perfect. We have a few shader basic parameters we can change here. An interesting one is the wire parameter. If we turn that on, the object will go ahead and render out in a wireframe, which is a very interesting effect, as you can see here. So just use your imagination and you could probably figure out what to use that for. A lot of people might decide to use that to do demo reels or portfolio pieces, things like that. Okay. Down here we have more parameters. These are specific to the blend shader that we're using. We have an ambient parameter and a diffuse parameter. Okay. So the diffuse right now is set to gray. Now this little icon this little button that's activated here is the lock button. What this button does, it locks the ambient and the diffuse colors together. So when I click on the diffuse color box here and this color picker comes up, I can change the color of the diffuse. So I could change it, say, to sort of this very light, this sort of cyan color. Hit OK. And if I hit Shift Q to render, there it goes, it updates. And there's a teapot. Now it looks cyan. Now the ambient color is copying the diffuse color. That's because it's locked. If I want, I can unlock it by clicking on that button. I can then click on the color box for the ambient, and I can change the color of the ambience to something else. Okay. I also have a specular color box here. Right now it's set to a value that's a little bit less than white. It's practically white, but not exactly white. Now you can't see any specular highlights on this right now because we don't have specular turned on. As you can see, the specular level is set to 0, which essentially turns it off. On the right here we have a little graph that we can use to see the specular level a little bit more visually. So let's go ahead and click on this spinner and increase that specular level by as much as we want. So I'll increase it by a good amount, and you can see the thumbnail here updated. If we double click the thumbnail, we'll open up another little thumbnail and you can see a better look at this blend shader. But the best way to look at it is by doing this test render over here on the left by hitting Shift Q, and we can see what it looks like with the specular highlights. That's pretty strong. We can use the glossiness parameter to change the sharpness of that specular highlight. So you can see as we change the glossiness, we completely affect the way that looks. Okay. We can also soften it up, which gives it a very soft, subtle effect, as you can see here. So right there it's less soft. When we soften it up by a lot, you can see the effect right there. It's very subtle, but it's there. We can also change the opacity of the shader. So if we lower the opacity, it'll look more like glass or something that you can see through, as you can see right there. Let's put the opacity back to 100 so it's no longer see-through. And we can also give this object self-illumination. So let's turn this on, and then from the color we can turn this to something bright. And now what will happen is this object will appear to be practically glowing. It'll be extremely bright. That's very good if you're doing a material for, say, a light bulb that's turned on, or anything that has its own self-illumination. So let's turn that off so it goes back to normal. Okay. Down here we have a maps rollout. If you open that up, you'll see that we can plug in different maps to the ambient color, the diffuse, the specular, as well as the specular level, glossiness, and so on and so forth. The reason for that is you can plug in maps. For example, say if we wanted to give this teapot a texture of a label that says, I don't know, i3D coffee or something like that. Well, you can use a 2D image editing program like Adobe Photoshop to create a texture or a label that says i3D coffee, and then you can import that into 3ds Max and plug it into the diffuse color. So let's plug something very quickly into the diffuse color of this. Let's click on this button that says None, and we'll get a material map browser window that opens up. Now what we have is a whole bunch of different options for plugging in a map into that map slot. We have bitmap, which was basically an image on your computer that you can use. You can use a photograph you took of yourself in case you want to put your face on the teapot. You can also use an image that you created in Adobe Photoshop, like the label example I just told you about, the i3D coffee. We can also put something else, like say this checker, which is a procedural texture in 3ds Max. So let's double click on checker. Okay, and let's do a render, and there we go. Now we have this checker material on top of the teapot. Let's go over here, and we can see in the material editor now we have options for controlling the way that this checker material looks. Now we have a ton of different options, so I'll show you a few of them. If you want this texture to tile more, you can go over here to where it says tiling in U and V, and you can change that. So say if you want to tile 10 times, you can put in 10 and 10, hit enter. Let's go ahead and render again. And now you can see that the checker texture is more dense. There's many more little checker tiles all over this teapot. Okay. We can also change other parameters for this teapot. Let me go ahead and put this back to 1 and 1, just so it's easier to see. Okay. Now over here we have the checker parameters. Now there's only 2 parameters for the checker texture. Basically the color 1 and the color 2, which is pretty obvious. The color 1 is controlling the black checkers, and the color 2 is controlling the white checkers. As you can see, we have map parameters. We can actually plug in other maps and materials into the colors to change it even further. So let's change the white. Let's change color 2. Let's click on None, and now we can see we could plug something else in there. So let's go ahead and let's plug in let's plug in a noise. So let's double click on noise. And here's our noise. So let's go ahead and do a render, and you see everything comes out gray now. Wherever the white is located, it comes out gray. Let's change that. Let's change the size to something very small here. So let's try something like 5. See what we get. Okay, not small enough, obviously. Let's change it to 1. Okay, now we're starting to see that noise take effect. Let's put it to something real small, like 0.1. Now we can really see some noise, which causes this graininess effect. Now the graininess effect is localized to only the white checkers and not the black, because that's what we applied it to. We could change the color of the noise. So we'll change the color 1 from a black to, say, maybe a green. See what that looks like. There you go. Maybe the white we can change to, say, a bluish lavender color. There we go. We could change some other things here. We could change the noise type from regular to fractal, for example, or to turbulence. Let's try fractal. And then we could change different settings here. So I'm just going to randomly change numbers and things here just to see what we get. So the noise is a little bit more pronounced in that case. Now if we want to go back a level, click on this button up here, the Go to Parent button, and that'll take us back up to the checker texture. And you can see the noise map is plugged in here. So it's kind of like a hierarchy. The noise is at the bottom. If we go up one level, we end up at the checker texture. If we go up another level, we end up back to the shader level. So you can see how that works. We can plug in other maps as well. We can plug in a specular map. We can plug in self-illumination, opacity, different things like that. So this is a very robust system that gives you a lot of flexibility and allows you to create a lot of effects. Pretty much the amount of effects and different materials you can create is endless. The possibilities are only limited by your own imagination. So I couldn't possibly sit here and take you through every possible combination of shaders and materials that exist, because I would probably be here till I'm a very, very old person. So let's go back up to the shader level, and I want to show you something else. Let's close this. If you notice, in this in the viewport, the teapot is still cyan or teal. It hasn't updated. How come we can't see the material on the teapot? Well, that's because you have to activate this button here. See this little checkerboard cube here? What the tooltip calls it the show standard map in viewport. This activates the map in the viewport so that it's visible here. So let's click on that to turn it on. And now you can see that the checker material pops up. Now, if you remember in the render video, I did mention that the viewport will never be as faithful to the final result as an actual final render will be. So this is not the direct representation of what this material looks like, because remember we plugged in a noise map to the white color. So the only way to see the final end result is to do a render, because the viewport's not going to show you the true final result. So that's extremely important to take note of and to understand. So let's close the material editor using M on the keyboard. That's gonna do it for the material editor. How to slap on materials real quick to your objects and how to make some changes. So I suggest when you get a chance, go into the material editor and start randomly making changes to a material or a shader and see what kind of neat effects and materials you can come up with.